Okay, everyone. We are going to get started on our next presentation. This presentation will run from 12:30 to 1:15, and then we'll take another quick break. This presentation is with Dusty LeMay and Al Littlejohn, two of my absolute favorite people who know more about identity documents than I think it is possible for any human being to know. Probably more about identity documents than any other person in the state at this point. So we are really learning from experts today. So Al and Dusty are going to talk with us about helping clients with identity documents, changing name and gender on identity documents. We'll do that for about 45 minutes, and then we'll move to our presentations on housing and then close out the day with domestic violence supports and family law. So I'm really looking forward to this presentation. Dusty and Al, I will let you to go ahead and introduce yourselves. Tell us a little bit about yourselves, what you do, and I'll let you take it away.
Great, thanks, Denise. Al, I'm gonna let you introduce yourself first real quick while I pull up the PowerPoint now that Denise's screen's not shared, if that sounds good, Al.
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Al Littlejohn. I use they, he pronouns, even though my name says Jesse Guecho right now. That is not who I am. I'm a community legal resource manager at QLaw. A big part of my job is just like community outreach and community education, making sure queer and trans folks have access to legal education that is actually person-friendly and more easy to understand, as well as just doing outreach across the state to other LGBTQ groups and communities to make sure or to see if they are connected with legal service providers in their areas. So happy to be a part of this, help y'all learn a little bit more and help y'all help our community statewide. Dusty's almost there. I can see myself.
Okay, can you all see the PowerPoint yet? I just shared the screen. You might have to turn your video off, so.
Ooh, let me do that.
And then as long as nobody else's screen is sharing. Yeah, it says can anybody see the PowerPoint yet? Tell me when you can.
Yes.
You should be able to. All right, great. Okie doke. So, my name's Dusty LeMay, and I live in the country and have really bad Wi-Fi reception where I live, so I'm not going to share my video. I might try to share it really quick so you can see who I am for a quick minute. Hi, everyone. I'm Dusty. I'm going to be talking to you today with Al about identity document stuff. I'm going to turn off my video real quick now that you've seen my face and get us back over to the PowerPoint. And I work at Northwest Justice Project, but my work with QLaw is primarily volunteer work around a program I run called Trans Advocacy in Rural Places. That was a fellowship for many years, and now is kind of quiet and sort of not active currently. So I'm doing this, just in a volunteer capacity, even though I do work at Northwest Justice Project. And I know one of my coworkers, Matt, I think is doing a presentation shortly after me about housing stuff in conjunction with actually NJP work, which is really, really cool. So this is kind of a volunteer related information for me. And so if you do need future follow-up about it, I just wanted to make that caveat that I'm not always super readily available. So probably getting in touch with QLaw to get any future information is going to be your fastest way to get stuff. But my hope is that after the end of the presentation here in about a half hour, you'll have enough of an introduction into all of the, the kind of first steps to these processes, plus all the documents that you need in an email resource we're going to send out, that you'll hopefully be able to move forward and help, pro bono clients in your communities, help people in your life, as well as help out at the clinics as needed when they're going on around your communities. So we're going to talk about name and gender validation legal processes. You're going to hear all kinds of terms for that. Every process has its own term, whether they call it an update, an amendment, a reflection, all those different kinds of things. But generally what we're talking about is how people change their legal name and legal gender on a variety of identity related documents. So we're going to focus on the main what we would think of as like local, state, and federal identity documents, but it affects everything, right? Bank records, voting ID, anything that has your identities listed on it.
Hey, Dusty. Dusty,
this is-
can I interrupt for 1 second? This is Denise. Because you're sharing from your phone, it's really
Yeah.
small. Would you like me to share instead, and you can just tell me to advance the slides when you're ready to advance?
That would be great. I was trying to flip the screen, but I'm using a free version of Canva, and I don't think it lets me. I don't think I have those permissions.
No worries. I've got it up.
Trying to turn my phone, and it won't do it.
Yeah, I've got it
Okay,
up
great.
and ready.
Okay, perfect. I'll just cue you. Thank you so much, Denise.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, great. Yeah, I again, since I'm kind of doing this on a volunteer thing, my best technology is this new phone I have, but I've never used my free Canva on it before, so this is way better. So the slide Denise is about to pull up is just a quick agenda about what we're going to talk about, and it really we're going to go really fast today. So think of this really as a quick introduction. We could spend easily 3 hours talking about all this stuff. Al's going to come on towards the end of the presentation and talk about kind of financial and community assistance. And then we're really hopefully going to have some time for Q&A. But we're going to go through a quick ethical introduction real quick. Oh, yeah. Okay, great. You canceled my screen share. Great, Denise. I just want to make sure. Talk about kind of the burdens of these processes for folks going through them, a little bit about the financial barriers and process and fee waivers, and then really move through how you can help out, right? So what are the different kind of steps that as legal community or community volunteers you can engage with? Okay, if you want to skip to the next one. All right, so I just wanted to always open up these kind of presentations with a quick reminder of some of our ethical obligations that are going to be, furthered by helping out community with these issues. And one of them is our model rule professional conduct, which asks us to help those who are experiencing access to justice barriers. And we're not going to talk a whole lot or much at all about any kind of trans 101 type stuff. But the one thing I do like to say is that, it's pretty statistically across the board, trans folks, gender diverse folks, non-binary folks, two-spirit folks are dealing with substantial legal barriers and access and accessing justice and in all kinds of ways, and getting representation and getting informed representation. An extra barrier here is often that these aren't traditional legal issues. They're considered administrative, so they're not something that people often think about getting legal help for, or that lawyers are even going to be able or feel comfortable helping out with. And because people have to navigate it pro se all the time anyway, a lot of times people don't think about it as an opportunity for pro bono work. But I like to remind everybody that there are two different opportunities explicitly that are actually casework when it comes to out-of-state birth certificates or name changes, right? And then there's all kinds of special issues too that do give you an opportunity to literally be able to rep cases, get pro bono case hours directly. We all have to do 50 hours a year, and name changes and gender-related update cases are a really, really affirming and positive way to get those pro bono hours in. Okay, next slide. Thanks, Denise. So I always just kind of like to start, if you are a gender diverse person in the room, you've probably navigated some of this yourself. If you've ever navigated a name change for any reason, you've probably navigated some of this stuff as well. And they can be really burdensome processes, especially to do pro se. When it comes to gender specific processes, it's really hard to find all this information in one centralized place sometimes, particularly linking the name and gender change, because name change in our state is a super highly local process. And we're going to talk about that. So it's really hard to go through. It's hard to go through as a professional helping someone. It's hard to go through as a volunteer. It's extra hard to go through as the person going through it. I'm also going to talk a little bit today about my lived experience with all these different processes as a trans person, and kind of what it looks like to navigate them, and why sometimes these barriers become walls and people stop at certain points for different reasons. So the processes are very different from one ID to another, or from one type to another. Like what you need to do for a name change in Washington is very different than what you need to do for updating gender on your passport or birth certificate. In general, it can be a really expensive process. The IDs themselves, one at a time, might not be that expensive, but we'll go through a slide that kind of lays out what the most expensive total could be, and it can be very, very cost prohibitive to be able to update all your IDs, let alone when we're talking about other expenses like energy, capacity, things like that. It's very stressful to go through these. as a trans person, one of the notes on the screen mentions the transphobic standards and exhausting kind of cycles of having to prove gender that folks have to go through that can make these processes burdensome and taxing in a way that's not even just financial. It's really hard to get these things sealed, if not impossible in certain circumstances. And for trans people particularly, there's a lot of good reason for gender diverse people and non-binary folks and trans folks to want to be able to seal the evidence kind of history of these. And so that, especially for name changes, is difficult. And then at other, other sort of sealing standards are going to vary from process to process, and all of those process requirements are quite confusing and specific to each one. So I'm going to try to introduce you to all of those as much as possible real quickly today, and definitely check out the chat. I saw something pop up about where people can get assistance, and I'm sure a lot of other really good feedback is going to come through the chat as well. And we're going to talk about some good spots and places to be tapping into ways to support community a little bit throughout the presentation, and especially at the end with Al. All right, next slide. Thanks, Denise. So just a quick picture of why it's so hard and costly sometimes to get accurate identity documents, and why many people can't afford to change all their different IDs, or why they can't afford lawyers to get them to help. And so at minimum, to get a name change, it's about $265 after the filing fee and the bare minimum number of certified copies you should get. And filing fees are regularly going up in Washington every few years. And so that is going to change probably in the future. And that's the first step, right? And so then any ID you have to update after the name change, if you're able to do it all at one time and change your name and your gender on every ID simultaneously, that's the most cost effective. But for certain people, they're not able to access everything they need to be able to change their name and gender on IDs at the same time. And so to be able to get everything updated often takes 2 rounds of ID updates. So sometimes these costs are duplicative. So you get the name change cost, the ID cost. A new passport is often expensive and can vary depending on your processing and where you get it done. Washington state birth certificates are relatively cheap. It's mostly administrative costs for birth certificate. But then depending on where you're born, if you need an out-of-state birth certificate update, like I was born in Oklahoma, if I want to change my gender, and specifically for gender updates, not name changes, most states are just going to require the name change order. But if you're going to try to change gender for an out-of-state birth certificate, so Washington, what that means is, and we're going to talk about this specifically, Washington residents who need to change their birth certificate from another state, unfortunately, the nebulous intersection of laws usually requires that myself as a Washington resident who currently has a birth certificate that doesn't reflect the gender I've been living in for 20 years, I would have to get a court order from a Washington judge to get my Oklahoma birth certificate updated, right? Which is a very strange kind of like wraparound process. And we'll talk about that, but it's also really expensive because you have to do a secondary filing fee. It's not that you can't combine it and the name change and they're in different courts. So kind of roundabout for me, like, as a person in my situation right now, if I was going to try to update all my ID documents in Washington and in the state I was born in federally, it would cost me roundabout at least $770 if I did it all in one simultaneous go. If I had to do it, doing my name change at one point and gender at a different point, that could double or get, even higher. And that's just kind of a roundabout. Sometimes there's even more administrative fees or additional certified copies cost and stuff like that, not including, again, all the other costs for going through court that might not be reflected in financial strain. Okay, so next slide. All right, so let's get into the actual details about how to help, right? So as I'm specifically speaking to legal community in the room and folks that might have that kind of experience, but generally everybody, if you have the ability to take pro bono cases and you have that responsibility for the actual attorneys in the room, when I was running TARP more actively and doing ID clinics around the state, my number one challenge was finding local volunteers in each county that would actually be willing to take pro bono cases for name changes, help people do the filing fee waivers that can still be really intimidating, even though technically we think as legal professionals, and the court kind of thinks that these should all be pro se processes. Yeah, they should maybe, but it doesn't mean that they're easy to navigate pro se, and it doesn't mean that, especially for trans or gender diverse folks, or BIPOC folks, or anybody dealing with other intersections, that they're not going to be burdensome, hard, and really kind of scary sometimes. So pro bono cases are a huge way to help. Volunteering at ID clinics, volunteering to help an ID clinic happen in your community, in any way that they're going on, supporting that you can. That doesn't have to just be lawyers. And then fundraiser filing fees and the cost to do updates to IDs. That's probably one of the biggest barriers, and often was the biggest struggle supporting all the pro se clients through the court navigation with TARP, the program I was running, was that you can give people all the help that you have, but if they can't afford to actually get in the door, then it's very frustrating and can be very useless in some ways. And so when it comes to filing fees, no matter what, even with a filing fee waiver, which I'm going to introduce you to and make sure you have the information for, you still aren't guaranteed a full waiver. A lot of judges in Washington state will only waive what they feel like they have the authority to waive, which does not include the recording fee. So in most counties, there's still going to be a $98 recording fee. So at a minimum, a person still needs $98 plus about $40 in certified copies to be able to get a name change, which is about $150. So even if you maximize your potential rights to get a filing fee waiver for a client, that you still have to get $150 together for a name change. And that's minimum, because a lot of counties might not qualify the filing fee waivers up to the judges. So that's kind of the biggest thing I tell folks. Fundraise where you can, support those that do, give money to the organizations that are distributing it out to community, or just give directly to community if you can. Okay, next slide, please. All right, so I'm going to try to flag some of the issues that are bigger than what we're going to talk about today, but just to get you introduced and to show you some opportunities for increased case help. The really tricky cases that are really hard for pro se to navigate, that really could benefit from legitimate pro bono case representation outside of a clinic setting, are going to be any name or gender change updates for minors, right? The processes are very different. We're only going to really talk about the details of the adult processes today. Minor processes are going to have different standards for each identity document and different standards of levels of consent between parents and the kid and doctors at times. So that just flagging that we're only talking about adult issues, and that name and gender changes for minors are a really specific and different process. There's a lot of increased need for name changes for people in Department of Corrections custody in Washington. It's a whole tricky owned project, and if anybody wants to help with that, I'm happy to kind of help talk shop and work around maybe what are some ways to get connected to prisoners who need support with name changes. The processes are very different. So again, what we're going to talk about today is name changes and other gender identity update documents for adults who don't have DOC status in Washington state. If you do have DOC status, those might be a good time to put an anonymous question in the chat, or send a private chat to me and Al, and we can work on getting you the info you need. And out-of-state birth certificates, like I introduced before, are going to be a really huge issue that are really complex cases to do pro se. They're complex for the judges. If you want a challenging pro bono case in this arena, I would encourage you to find someone around the state that has this issue. There are plenty of Washington residents who are born in states that require these really burdensome processes to update birth certificates. Next slide, please, Denise. Okay. So I'm going to get through this real quick so that we can kind of get you at least kind of seen it at all the different steps, and then get to questions and time with Al. So you start with a name change, and that is in local district courts in Washington state. The typical order, and you're going to see from all the different organizations around, whether it's locally to nationally or regionally, there's different maps about you go through this step, then this step, then this step. The one that I always tell people is name change, then social security, then tribal and state ID. Oftentimes you'll see state ID before social security, but particularly you should always try to change social security as fast as you can after a name change, because there can be ramifications for tribes and for certain Department of Licensing in certain states. I don't think Washington is one, but in California, for example, one of our near states, you have to do social security first. So you can't get your driver's license. So just practically, it's often best to just do name change, then social security, then tribal state and state IDs, then birth certificate and or passport. Depending on the person, most people might not want to deal with birth certificate if it's burdensome, and we'll just do passport. Next slide, Denise. Thanks. So more on name changes, and you're going to get a copy of the PowerPoint. So again, you don't have to, you'll have a reference for this. So RCW 424-130 is the one that rules name changes in Washington state. And particularly, this is for anyone you're helping that doesn't have a domestic violence related need for the name change. If there's a provable history of what qualifies as domestic violence under the statute referenced, you can kick that over to Superior Court and ask for a seal, which can often be a good safety and practical protective mechanism for a trans person who is experiencing domestic violence. So this is specifically for name changes that aren't going to be, it's very hard to seal a name change except for that domestic violence risk under Washington law. So most name changes for trans people, even if they want them sealed for privacy reasons, you're not going to be able to. You have to file them in district court, which can be really weird because a lot of times we're not going to district court for most other reasons. A lot of pro se parties have maybe never gone to district court. It can be really confusing. The district courts are often embedded in the superior courts. Sometimes they're not, depending on what county you're in. So those highly local processes are about place and practice, not just forms, but there are also highly local forms. So every name change is different per county and per adult to minor. And every single one is not shareable among counties, and about half of them or more are not available online, and you have to go to the actual clerk to get them. So it is a very highly local process, and it is there's a lot of benefit to having local people on the ground willing to help navigate this process, for folks. And then fee waivers are really important for the name changes. Like I illustrated before, at minimum, you should prepare people to spend $150 just for the name change. Best case scenario, a judge will waive the entire filing fee and they only need about $50 for certified copies. But that historically has not been what I have seen across the state. And usually judges don't feel like they have the authority to do that and will rule to waive everything but the recording fee. So, $150 is what people need to plan. But even to get to that $150 minimum, you still have to file a fee waiver for clients or pro bono pro se folks that are eligible. So next slide, please. So other quick name change issues. Right now, since COVID, court schedules are incredibly unpredictable, and particularly because name changes happen in the highly local small district courts, often that only have one judge or might share judge, depending on if you're in the rural counties. The court schedules are really all over the place, and they were to begin with name changes. Most of the courts would only do name changes on a certain day of the week or a certain day of the month and a certain time of the docket, and it was always the same, and you didn't have any flexibility. It's even more so now because of COVID, right? And like everything, all the courts, all of the administrative update processes for these, everyone's running behind because of COVID. So I just like to caveat that this court scheduling is tricky, and unfortunately, during COVID times, name changes are one of the only court cases that usually goes forward in person, because you have to usually prove personhood for the fraud requirement for name changes. So it can be really tricky to do these in Zoom. That's basically folks are having a hard time accessing it in that way. So usually you're going to have to plan on showing up in person for these kind of issues. It can require your client or the person filing to be present to prove their identity during filing as well, right? Which again is another COVID specific issue. People are going to have to be comfortable and able to show up at the courthouse probably twice for these processes. And again, they're highly local petition processes and order styles. So you really need to default to the local clerks on those. And they all should be recently updated in the last few years, after the Attorney General did a big change on all the statewide name change forms a few years ago. Okay, next slide, please.
Dusty, actually, I have a question for you before we move to the next slide. And since I'm in charge of them, I'm going to ask it before we...
Yeah, go for it. Yeah, I can't even see that in, so go for it.
Okay. The question that I had that has come up for us a couple of times is, because name changes are required to be completed in, they're required to be completed in the county that you live in, some clerks we have heard ask clients for their ID and must show a local address. I was wondering if you have any thoughts about how widespread that is. Like, is it routine practice of the clerks in every county? And do you have any suggestions for folks who might be unhoused or who might have an ID with an old address on it, but still, obviously if they want to get their name changed, they're going to want to update their ID, and they maybe want to do it all at one time. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, no, great question. And there is a jurisdictional requirement for name change for the judges. So the clerks are actually pretty strict about this usually. And I have seen it widespread. I don't think it's one of those. I think sometimes as trans people, we worry like, is this county just making extra barriers because they don't like trans people? But in my experience, you usually have to prove address because there's a specific jurisdictional requirement. Most of the name change petitions make you say that on that petition itself as well. They make you attest to living in the county in some shape or fashion. So there are ways around it. And in TARP, I worked a lot with houseless clients or clients that were going between a lot of counties. And so they weren't really sure where, sometimes they stay, sometimes they stay with cousin, sometimes they stay at shelter, and they might, be going between 3 counties in a certain area, and they weren't sure which to file in. So you need, again, unfortunately, it's super county specific, and you just have to get in touch with the local clerk for each situation and find out what the residency requirements are, because they're going to be similar for other, whatever the local district court's process is for proving residency. They should let a name change gender diverse person file under that as well. But they're really specific. So it might be that, oh, you don't have an ID that's current. Well, then we'll take any bill from your house, or we'll only take a utility bill, or we'll take a utility bill and a telephone bill, or we'll take a letter from your landlord signed saying that you live there, or we'll, there's just, everyone is different, and it's very highly local to the court. So the best practice I developed was just, somebody walks in the door with an issue around address or jurisdiction, where they should file. You got to talk to them and kind of figure out where it does seem like they would be most likely in a court's eyes to live, but it's better to call the court first and find out what their requirements are, because then you can kind of help the person figure out what they need proof wise for that. Usually you've got to prove that at the filing, right? So it's the clerks who are going to have that power and that barrier. Once you get before the judge or are actually like attesting to what's on your petition in front of the judge, usually your address has already been proved. But it is a huge issue, for folks that are getting reentry right out of prison. If they haven't gotten any, sometimes the DOC certificate is so unfamiliar to clerks, they won't accept it. There's a lot of problems around that jurisdictional address requirement, and kind of there's some specific issues and challenges around name change living where it lives anyway in local district court. And it might be benefited to have a statewide process for that, but that's still probably a few years out, if ever going to happen in our state at this point. So that's a great question. That's another thing to make sure folks know, is that you should apply in the county in which you would be considered a resident. And residency shouldn't be attached to having house status. Ideally, there should be other ways that you can show residency. And I think like including just saying like, you might be able to attest on your petition in some way with an attached exhibit that, just a statement that you stay most often in this county, or your trailer is parked in this county most of the year, whatever, stuff like that. So, okay. Hopefully
Thank you very much. All right,
yeah,
now that's very helpful. Now I'm advancing to the next slide.
Okay, and this one's just a reminder, name changes are really, they're, compared to other cases, they're quick. At the maximum, you should have 1 hearing and 2 presents at court, 1 to help file and 1 for the actual hearing. And it's a really great and easy way that is so life affirming for people to get your pro bono hours in. So, and if more lawyers did even half the pro bono hours on name change cases, it could really, really impact the amount of trans and gender diverse people out there in our state that are going through these challenges alone, and oftentimes get fed up and won't do it, or just it could give into the barriers and don't finish the things they need to, including myself. And I'll talk about that in the next slide, I think, as we get to Social Security, when you're ready to go, Denise. Yeah, so Social Security, you can do a name or gender change or both, right? So you can do it all at once, or you can do it in two steps. People are like, gender doesn't have, Social Security doesn't have gender, but it does. Even though our Social Security cards don't list gender, our Social Security record does. And so as you'll learn, like for me, as a trans person that's been out about 20 years and halfway through that, did a name change and did some of my legal gender change, but not all of it. Social Security records follow you in places you don't expect, and your gender can pop up in hospitals, in credit checks, when you get deep credit pulled for applications. There's just ways that your gender shows up that you don't know about because you don't think about it, because we don't deal with our social security records as a printed record. So you actually have to go through a kind of obtuse and confusing process to change your gender on the record. Name change just requires a new social security card form and the name change court order. But to change your gender marker, currently it requires a medical letter, similar to the passport letter, but those are both in the process of changing as well right now. So for now, we're continuing with the old requirement of the letter and only 2 genders, but eventually Social Security will probably catch up to the new passport administrative rule, which is that there'll be 3 genders and the medical standard will have changed. But for now, you're limited to choosing only the binary genders of male or female. And even if your other IDs might say differently on the, that's the thing, is that in Washington state now, we can have X gender marker, female gender marker, or male gender marker on state IDs and birth certificates, but on our federal IDs, we still would have to choose male or female. So you're going to have a lot of folks who are going to be living with mixed IDs by force. There's, by necessity, there's no other choice. As a person like me, I'm a person who lives with mixed IDs because of being exhausted by the barriers and giving up and never changing my gender with Social Security because it was much more of an obtuse process 12 years ago, even than it is now. So next slide. So Social Security, is primarily, you just kind of do it all in the one form, turn in the doctor's letter, navigate it, and eventually they send you the new one. The main thing about timing is that you should do Social Security first after name change before everything else, and then do tribal ID, so tribal enrollment forms or your tribal ID card, your certificate, degree of Indian blood card, anything tied to tribal identification enrollment should be done after your Social Security change, even if you're living your reality in a sovereign nation and you're much more likely to just be present in your tribal areas and not be going in to where the Social Security offices are. You should still do your Social Security first, because your tribe can be fined if you update with them after. If you update with your tribe first and Social Security gets notified by the tribe, then your tribe can be fined. So always do Social Security first, then do your tribal jurisdiction stuff and all the IDs related to it, and make sure that you're not triggering your tribe being fined by the feds. And then next slide. So state IDs in Washington, I already touched on this a little bit. We can have X gender marker, F gender marker, or M gender marker. Right now in the state of Washington, many of the states around the country have more than 2 gender markers now, and have for years now. And you can change your name or your gender on the state IDs in Washington, or both. Again, you can do them in different stages or at once, but they do require different forms. You can mail in or walk in the applications. If you are, it's basically the regular driver's license new form. If you're just doing a name change and you have to provide the name change order. But to change your gender on an ID where maybe you don't need a name change, but you just want to change your gender, or you've done a name change and you're ready to do the gender now, that's a specific form. It's 520-043, but it's going to be attached to the resource email that you're going to be sent. So it doesn't require doctor's attestation or anything like that. It's just literally the person gets to pick the gender they identify as, sign and go. You'll just be mailed a new driver's license in the mail. If you want a new picture though, they have to go in to take the picture. Gender marker in Washington state for adults doesn't require medical proof of any kind or a doctor's letter. It's just the checkbox form. And this is when I say state IDs, this is like, Washington state ID or driver's license. And then next slide. And then, so birth certificates are Washington born. So this is specifically different than people born out of state who are residents like myself. So for Washington born, it's a very simple vital statistics form, but it does have to be notarized if you're going to change gender. And again, this is for adults. It's a different process for people under 18. You can choose X, F, or M for your gender designation to get your birth certificate reprinted. And there's no medical proof. You do have to get it notarized. So that's the main burden. But you do have to provide a name change order if you're changing your name. But that's across the board with any of these processes. Next slide. So the really tricky one, again, is like my situation, a Washington resident who was born in another state that wants their birth certificate to reflect their lived identity, right? So Oklahoma, my birth state, has a very specific administrative rule that requires very specific court order wordings, which attest to very specific body surgeries and modifications to be able to update my birth certificate. And that court order can either come from Oklahoma, if I was still living there, or the state in which I'm a resident. This is a very confusing and complex process. About half the states in the country require these kind of things right now. Judges are confused by it. Lawyers are confused by it. Pro se people are confused by it. There's a bench guide that I made that will help you navigate it. If this is something you're going to help people navigate, these are live and active issues around Washington state. You know, I can think of 6 people in my life right now who are Washington residents that need this done, myself included. The wordings must be really exact. Medical proof must be really exact. I would encourage that if you're going to help someone with this, if someone comes through the clinic and needs help with this, you reference the guide. It's about a 8-page long guide that'll walk you through all the court arguments you need to make. You can provide it as an exhibit to the judges. It'll show you, you know, where to get to each of the state's rules for each of the birth state you might be dealing with, so that you can make sure the model order and the requirements for that state are met explicitly by your client's body situation as well as your order that you're drafting. Next. And then, oh, and so yeah, just another plug. These are really, really difficult and hard. So like for me, it's impossible for me to update my birth certificate without this change. So many people are living in that situation. And again, this is just a reminder, use the bench guide. And if there's a question about how you can file it, you file it under, this files in your superior court, not in district court. And you would file it under the RCW for special proceedings otherwise not heard. It's basically like a general catch-all jurisdiction. And that's usually worked just fine when I've had to navigate this through court in the past. Next slide. We're just going to wrap up real quick, I think, with passports is where we're heading to. Oh, maybe my screen screws. Oh, there it goes. Yep. Okay. So you should all be able to see the passport slide. So I think that this is maybe the PowerPoint from last night. It might not have the updated numbers on it, but there's or maybe it does. It says not available yet. So yeah, this is the updated one. So passport rules just changed. The main thing to remember is that it can be name or gender change or both, like always. But if there's never been a passport before, then it's just all going to be one new passport application, right? You don't have to go through the which form is it. But if someone's had a passport before, you do have to determine which form they need based on what changes they're having. So name change just requires a name change order. For now, gender marker change does require a medical letter, but that's going to be changing soon. Again, for now, we're limited to male and female options on the passports, but I think there will be a third gender option soon. The process isn't made public yet. And depending on, you know, the person's situation, you're going to need to direct them to a different form. So on the next slide, real quick, Denise, thanks. I'll show you which forms you need. Yep. So, so the main thing is that if you're only changing a name for someone who has had a passport before, then you just need a renewal form, which is DS-82. You need the name change order, of course. But if you're changing name and gender, so the main thing is that gender triggers instead of a renewal, they basically create a new passport. So you do DS-11, which doesn't make sense for a person who's had a passport before because it's a new passport form. But if you're changing gender, you do have to do a DS-11. And there are very specific rules for the gender change proof. You need to reference the medical letter that they require on the passport website, and then very different rules for minors as well. So we have a few minutes left. I want to pass it off to Al, who's going to talk about financial assistance that's available around the state and nationally, and just kind of plug community support. And then we'll open it up for broader questions that people can ask. And hopefully in the next few minutes while Al's talking, I'll check out the questions in the chat so we can get to them in the last few minutes. Thanks very much.
All right, y'all, it's me again, Al. So very quickly, as Dusty mentioned, amending your identity documents can be very, very costly. And the number one thing we hear is, okay, once we know how to do the process, how do I pay for the process? So a couple of different local groups. There's the Trans Women of Color Solidarity Network, which primarily is like in Seattle, works around CTAC, but offers funds statewide. There's VietQ for queer and trans folks who are Vietnamese or come from the nation of Vietnam, maybe in groups who have not been recognized by the nation, as well as Indigenous and Black folks across the state. Northwest Youth Services has a project, the Queer Youth Project, based out of Bellingham, and they offer financial assistance for youth 15 to 24. And then we also have the Diversity Alliance, the Puget Sound, which is based in Olympia, but also offers financial assistance statewide. And then nationally, we have the National Center for Trans Equality. Their application is open right now for folks needing assistance. And then there's also the Black Trans Task Force, which is based out of Tacoma, primarily works in CTAC. Their fund is currently on hold. And then there's the National Trans Lifeline that also has micro grants, and theirs is also currently on hold. So if you come across any clients who could fall into any of these identity groups, I encourage you to please reach out to them. A lot of them are mainly through like Instagram and Facebook.
Awesome. Thanks, Al. And I just looked at Trans Lifeline's site yesterday, and I think they're reopening after basically next month. They're not reopening. It was like they're on break till September 1st, essentially. Right. And so check back in, and they used to do twice a year call outs. And I just tell people, check in kind of regularly with that stuff. So I looked at the chat real fast, and name changes for minors are a great clinic idea. I think Denise did put a really good caveat warning in there that you have to have both parent consent, unless even in my experience, in situations of full parent custody where there's protection orders, you still have to have both parents consent. Name change, parental consent for minors in Washington is a really strict rule. I have rarely seen judges interpret it otherwise, if ever. So when you do these in clinic settings like at Lambert House, it can be really tricky because you're going to have a lot. I used to be the executive director of Stonewall Youth in Olympia for many years. It's an LGBTQ youth drop-in center. So many of the youth that came to that space would not be able or safe to ask their parents to sign that. You have to be really, really cautious sometimes with doing them in embedded settings. It might be better to do something like at LCYC and not embedded at Lambert House. Or if you're doing it at Lambert House, do it like in connection with if there's a parents group there, maybe like the parent and youth group, because it's the biggest barrier to minor is like, if you've got two parents that are consenting, it's great. You probably have already gotten it done. For most youth that need this, it's because they don't have parents that are going to consent, or it's not safe for them. And, for folks that have been able to get those name changes, I saw the lawyer that put it in the thread, that also might have been, as a lawyer being able to navigate it as well, but that is rare. Like, I have supported multiple clients where the judges were like, nope, you have to, we still have to give notice to the other party. And, a lot of times, like notice or consent, but usually it's both. And the notice alone can be really risky. So if you're able to help people navigate that, especially if you've done it for yourself, there is a huge need for that around the state. And I think that could be a great opportunity for pro bono work, especially if you've had success and if you have precedent that you're willing to share, that can be, helpful for that. But yeah, name change for minors is really, really great. The barriers is that it has some of the more strict parental consent requirements. And then there was a good question about fraud. Judges do ask a lot in normal name change settings. From what I've understood from judges and working with them, is that the primary standard for judge questioning during general name change hearings is actually going to be around fraud. And if people are trying to get away from registration statuses, from fraud, from bankruptcy, there will be a lot of highly personal questions around if someone's trying to skip on child support, stuff like that. When it's somehow made clear to the court, either by the nature of the name changes or anything else attested to in the petition or by the party, that the person is getting a name change because of identity reasons, clearly related to gender usually, or something related to what is obviously an identity name change. Usually in my experience, judges, it's very opposite. They don't ask a lot of questions. They totally get it. You have to attest on most of the petitions that it's not for fraud. There's no fraudulent reasons anyway. So they will usually accept that attestation that's already been, signed under perjury by the petitioner. In my experience, that's been sufficient. I'm so surprised about that. Although it was King County, which, again, my program was focused on rural areas. So it was oftentimes everywhere but King County. But I will say, though, I often use King County precedent to help encourage other counties for what to do. So I just think that's a really great example and point, Suzanne, about in the chat about, how you can use your personal and professional experience to make some pretty big impact around the state for gender diverse minors who might be in really tricky parent custody situations. Most often I've found that the folks would rather wait and just wait till they turn 18. If they're close, then deal with abusive parents and just things like that. So if there's ways around it, if there's one supportive parent and you know a way around that legally, that could be super helpful. But just kind of wrap up with the name change fraud requirement. I wouldn't worry about that too much. If you're dealing with folks with DOC status, there's some really specific things you need to coach them on. And there's just some really specific hurdles for people that are still in custody specifically. But it's often that judges enjoy name change. What judges is that they enjoy name change hearings because they're very life affirming and because they don't have to go through as much of the like, are you running from fraud questions and stuff like that. They kind of get to ask a person, you know, how is this going to help change your life? Like they usually ask them like, you know, good, just, you know, interested personal life questions in my experience. So there should not, and also name changes shouldn't be denied, just kind of generally across the board, unless it's a vulgarity or maybe a copyrighted trademark term or even a celebrity name is maybe the only things, but otherwise almost any kind of name change that's submitted in Washington state should be approved. So yeah, we're getting at the 1:15 mark and I want to be cognizant of the time. I know there was a break and I think breaks are pretty important, but I don't know if any other questions came in the chat. People feel free to unmute or Denise unmute and ask any that came through, or if anybody has any real quick for this last minute, any more burning questions?
I did not see any additional, oh, we just got one coming in. Have you worked with anyone who got through this process with an ACP address? I'm not sure what an ACP address is, but hopefully the person in the chat will elaborate. It sounds like it can depend a lot on a specific district.
Yeah,
As confidentiality program, I clarified.
Yeah. So it's usually you have to fill out the case information cover sheet for most of the counties for a name change petition, and so if they're already in it, you would want to trigger that. But it depends on if the ACP programs between the Superior Court and district courts are talking to each other, or if there's separate processes. I only bring that up because the local district courts have so many highly local processes for certain things. I would just say, if a person is in the address confidentiality program, to be asking the court what they should ask the court that before you file the petition, or as the first step when you walk in to file the petition, because you might want to amend what the petition says before you file it, depending on what the court's answer is. My guess is most of them are going to be communicating with the superior courts and be sharing that stuff, but not always. So you might have to take specific processes at your local district court to get usually what's a specific cover sheet. It's like there's going to be a confidentiality cover sheet that you would have to fill out. And so the other really kind of like side note to what that question that was just asked, which is a good reminder for me to bring up, is that these are public record, right? We don't have to publish name changes in newspapers like we have to do in other states often, like I had to do in California when I got my name change, but it's still public record. And so that's really stressful for gender diverse people, knowing that, I mean, it's stressful for me as a person that is out in the world, and technically could be found. So yep, exactly, yeah. So Al just said that they had to post theirs in a Kansas paper. When I posted mine in California 12 years ago, I got doxxed online because of it, before doxing was even really a word that I knew, and by two different parties. So, and I lived in a little tiny town. I don't think anybody was going to see it. So there are some benefits about Washington's name change process, like we don't have to post it in papers, but it's still public, which is why a lot of folks will ask you to get it sealed, and you unfortunately have to say that you can't unless there's a really acute and explicit provable situation of immediate domestic violence. So even for minors, like very much even for minors. So yeah, so anyhow, hopefully that kind of answers that a little bit. I'm trying to see another thing that came in. You're very welcome, everyone. Thanks for the appreciation. I just had to post a oh yeah, so this is a great point that Al brought up. There's a place on most name change forms, every it's different, but most name change forms will say, what is the reason for this name change? And I always tell people, you can be as explicit about your gender identity or as private about it as you want to be. So again, I remind them that it's public record though. So I try to tell them, you don't have to say, I am a transgender person and this is the name I use, right? You can if you want to, or you can say whatever your identity is, but you can also say something really vague and self-protective and private, like just cut off all of the gender identity part and say, this is the name I live with. That's it. That's plenty. That's enough of a reason to grant you a name change. This is the name I live with. This is the name that suits my identity. And usually that's enough, for a judge to understand.
Well, thank you very much to Al and Dusty for this really, really helpful session. I think it's really, really informative. And the thing that I try to really keep in mind with our services is that, again, we are not the people who are walking into the courtroom with folks. And so it is super important to have a good working knowledge of these processes and some of the nuances that Dusty was telling us about. And I just also want to stress that when you're volunteering at clinic, one of the things that we can help with is some of these phone calls to clerks and things like that, that if you're not sure, for example, like maybe you don't find out until the meeting with the client that they're unhoused and have some address uncertainty, just flagging that for us gives us the ability to look up in the and do some of the research for you and provide client follow-up for what the answer is. So with that, thank you again to Dusty and Al. We are running a little bit behind time, but I do want to give folks a stretch break. So if you can come back, it's 1:21. If you can come back at 1:25, and we will start our next session on housing and some housing 101, particularly important right now. And we'll be joined by Matt Woods, who is another of Northwest Justice Project's amazing attorneys. So please come back at 1:25.